One of the most controversial and highly debated leaders of our time, particularly in the political world, is former President George W. Bush. The office of President of the United States is one of the most difficult leadership positions in the world. No matter the situation or the decision the president makes, there will always be people who disapprove. How a leader handles this is a mark of what makes a good president. George W. had the highest approval rating on record and also one of the lowest during his presidency, according to CBS News. Bush has been highly praised for his leadership through the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, and also highly criticized for his foreign policy efforts and economic collapse of 2008. Whether in praise or in criticism, George W. is one of the most talked about and researched leaders of the recent past, so it is only fitting to discuss him in the context of leadership and communication. In examining his leadership style, it is important to begin with a brief history. George W. Bush was the 43rd President of the United States. He had about a 15-year career as a major political leader and has since retired from politics. Being the son of a politician, President George H.W. Bush, one would expect that George W. would have been a career politician, but that was not the case. After graduating with an MBA, he was a career businessman in the oil industry. He truly began his career in politics by supporting his father's campaign for president in 1988. George W. had made a brief campaign for Texas State House of Representatives, but lost. His first real political leadership role was the governor of Texas from 1995 to 99. From there, he campaigned and was elected president over Al Gore in the controversial 2000 election. He served as president through January 2009. After finishing his presidency, he has been a less than prominent public figure, which is to be expected after leaving office with one of the lowest approval ratings on record, according to a Gallup poll conducted in 2009.
One frequently discussed concept regarding leadership is the manner in which leaders react to the challenges they face. For instance, Adam Dawkins writes, "You demonstrate who you really are in difficult situations, for better or for worse. The best characteristics of leaders emerge in these moments." This resounds especially true for someone in the presidential office, who acts as a national figurehead and a beacon of hope in times of tragedy and distress. America has always and continues to use this concept to gauge the overall success and effectiveness of its presidents. Vanita Bali writes, "What distinguishes effective leaders from others is not just their technical or functional expertise, but their ability to handle adaptive challenges. This is one of the reasons Bush has always been highly praised for his term as president." On September 11, 2001, the United States was rocked by the worst domestic terrorist attack on our country in its history. An otherwise sluggish start to Bush's presidency was jolted into high gear by quite possibly the worst tragedy the country has ever faced. In his remarks on the day of the event, Bush was shaky until he made a strong statement from the Oval Office. He changed dramatically in the days following and delivered very deeply moving speeches in honor of the victims in both Washington and New York City. Greenstein refers to Bush as being a compelling public presence after the attacks. Bush's approval rating skyrocketed to 90%, the highest ever recorded by a president, in the weeks following the attacks. How a leader reacts to the challenges they face is a mark of their emotional intelligence. The quality is of extreme importance to the office of president, as they have the power to make rash, reactive decisions that can adversely affect a nation for years to come. What is critical is that their public actions not be distorted by uncontrolled passions, writes Greenstein. The terrorist attacks of September 11 were the biggest test of emotional intelligence that Bush faced during his term as president and commander-in-chief. Jennifer George describes the major aspects of emotional intelligence as management of emotions, knowledge about emotions, the appraisal and expression of emotion, and the use of emotion to enhance cognitive processes and decision-making. George W. Bush had a strong emotional intelligence in his response to the terrorist attacks in a number of ways.
Bush first displayed very strong management of his own emotions and those of others, and his immediate reactions. Rather than responding initially with a passionate, reactive speech, he stuck to clean, almost robotic statements. Though many believe this to be a poor display of empathy, Bush was using his knowledge about emotions and that most of the nation was in shock. Therefore, it was too soon to make a passionate statement. This enabled him to ultimately make a stronger statement after he was able to process the gravity of the events facing the U.S. and its citizens. He utilized strategic expression of emotion in his speeches, consoling the victims of the attacks. Upon addressing the rescue workers in New York, Bush's passion ignited as he said to them, "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." Finally, Bush absorbed the pain and emotion that the U.S. was facing and used it in making strong decisions about how to take action against Al-Qaeda.
A number of other factors contributed to the resounding support Bush received following the 9/11 attacks. Bush was able to unite the public in opposing political forces under a rally around the flag effect, which Chowanites described as a very large movement of public and elite support in favor of the government that aims at defending the country in times of peril. His political moves following the attacks were met with resounding support from the public because they were perceived to be in defense of our country. Competing political parties abandoned their disputes and pushed policies through that were immediately going to combat terrorism. Jeffrey Cohen examines presidential leadership of public opinion and suggests that the goal of a presidential communication is important in addressing theory of presidential effects because presidential communication is inconsistently effective in changing public opinion. In most of Bush's communications to the public after 9/11, he was not aiming to change any public opinion or rally support for a campaign. The goal was to console the nation and assure them that the attacks would not go unpunished. In doing so, the effects were very strong because people did not have a reason to object. Another factor was that George W. Bush physically looked presidential in the time after the attacks. Brian Spicek asserts that during times of conflict and war, the general public is more drawn to leaders that appear older. This innate bias, Spicek describes, provides a clear example of why people rallied around him in the aftermath. During his speeches and public appearances, Bush appeared aged and distraught. People saw him as a leader and encouraged his foreign policy moves as a result. This idea of looking presidential remained very important in how the public perceived George W. Bush following the attacks and throughout his term. Bush had many successes as a president, but after all those, how is it that Bush left office with such a high disapproval rating? The answer is that his strengths and emotional intelligence were largely abandoned in the latter half of his first term and into his second term. Bush had a major shift in his approach to leadership following 9/11 that engulfed him. Though he handled the immediate aftermath very well, he shifted to a policy-driven leadership approach that was positive in advancing programs but often had adverse effects, according to Greenstein. This new approach proved to be a huge downfall for Bush in that he lost his connection with the people.
An example of Bush's policy-driven approach is the Freedom Agenda, which addressed freedom, human rights, and democracy. It was a crucial part of the Bush doctrine and thoroughly integrated into his foreign policy, according to Patterson and Amaral from 2009. George W. Bush not only articulated the traditional themes of democracy and freedom, but instituted a range of foreign policy inputs, from free trade agreements to meetings with activists to public diplomacy initiatives, once again from Patterson and Amaral. This agenda was rooted in Bush's policy-driven approach to presidential leadership and was carried out in the form of action. Most would say that the Freedom Agenda was not a bad thing to be pushing from a theoretical and moral standpoint. The practical approach did not receive wide approval from the public. There was support for his policy of a bombing campaign on Al-Qaeda, but Bush insisted that putting troops on the ground was necessary to complete the campaign. The public perceived that this was to be a short campaign, but it was not, and that as time progressed, his approval rate began to plummet. As long as the Iraq War continued, Bush's approval continued to drop. The main reason Bush failed as a leader from the common mistake of forgetting about the people you were working for and with. In summary, George W. Bush was a very interesting leader of our time that a lot of lessons can be learned from. He recorded the highest approval rating in history and fell to one of the lowest by the time he left office. Strengths and emotional intelligence can be extremely valuable when a leader is tested by an unexpected change or tragedy, as was a huge success with Bush after the 9/11 attacks. It was when Bush abandoned this skill for a policy-driven approach that he lost connection with the American people he was serving, and was a huge failure. Despite the controversy, it is important to recognize that Bush is an extremely valuable person to study in the context of leadership.